in the sprawling, restless city of Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered like dying stars and the buildings leaned against each other like exhausted old men, there lived a young woman named Vivien Vasquez who had learned to make herself invisible. She moved through the pre-dawn diner like a ghost who had forgotten she was dead. The checkered floor, black and white squares worn to a uniform gray beneath orthopedic shoes, stretched out beneath her feet as she glided from booth to booth, collecting crumbs of other people's hunger. A coffee cup here, a plate of half-eaten eggs there, the sticky residue of syrup that never quite washed away no matter how hard she scrubbed. The neon sign outside cast everything in a sickly pink light, and at 3 in the morning, the booths held only the occasional insomniac, the lonely, the ones running from something they would not name. Her apron was stained with the debris of a 7-hour shift. Coffee grounds. Bacon grease. The faint brown smudges of gravy that had dried into the fabric weeks ago. She counted her tips on the counter, $1, $2, 5 more crumpled in the pocket, and when she reached $34, she stopped counting. That was all. $34 to stretch across a week. $34 that needed to feed Noah, pay the electricity bill that was already 3 weeks overdue, and somehow find a way toward the $47,000 that hung over her head like a guillotine blade. $47,000 for his heart surgery. The apartment she returned to at dawn was a studio, barely larger than a closet, with a kitchenette that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and mold creeping up the corner where the ceiling leaked. She pushed open the door quietly, the hinges screamed if you were not careful, and there was Noah, 7 years old, sleeping on a cot in the far corner. His small chest rose and fell beneath a blanket she had pulled from a donation bin 6 months ago. On the nightstand beside him sat his medication bottles, lined up like tiny glass soldiers. Atenolol. Digoxin. Names she had learned to pronounce in the dark, the way other mothers learned lullabies. She did not turn on the light. Instead, she moved to the kitchen counter where the medical bills sat in a stack she refused to organize, refused to open, refused to accept as real. $8,000. $12,000. $17,000. Each statement was a punch she could not block. The cardiologist's face floated in her memory, kind but clinical, his words precise and devastating: valve replacement surgery, congenital defect, without intervention, his prognosis worsens each month. 7 days. That was what stuck with her now. The appointment was in 7 days. 7 days to find $47,000. She had 34. The November cold pressed against the apartment's single window. Outside, the city hummed with the sound of trucks and distant sirens, the endless white noise of a place that never slept. She stood at that window for exactly 3 minutes, 3 minutes she could not afford to waste, and stared at the street below where garbage tumbled in the wind like autumn leaves. Then she turned away. There was no time for this. There was never time for this. The knock came exactly 7 days later, at 6 in the morning, just as the first grey light was breaking across the city like a promise nobody would keep. Vivien opened the door in her work clothes, already dressed, already preparing to drag herself back to the diner for another double shift, and froze. The hallway was no longer empty. It was filled with men. Black suits. Black ties. Black overcoats that cost more than her annual rent. They stood in perfect formation, motionless as statues, their eyes fixed forward with the blank discipline of people trained to feel nothing. Behind them, visible through her open door, she could see the street below filled with black SUVs, their windows tinted so dark they looked like the eyes of sharks. One man stepped forward. Middle-aged, silver threading through his dark hair, face weathered like old leather. His name was Marco, though she did not know that yet. He held a leather briefcase in his right hand and an expression that suggested he had delivered messages like this before. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said. His voice was careful, precise, the kind of voice used in courtrooms and funerals. "I'm not," she started, but the word died in her throat. She was not a Mrs. She was not anything, really. She was just Vivien. Behind her, she heard movement. Noah had woken. He appeared at her shoulder, still in his pajamas, his small face confused and then frightened. His medication made him drowsy, and it took his brain a moment to process what he was seeing. "Mama," he said, his voice barely audible. "Who are they?" She put her hand on his shoulder. Her hand was shaking. Marco did not move. He simply opened the briefcase and removed a document, which he held out to her with both hands, the way you might offer a holy relic. "This is for you," he said. "From Mr. Caruso." The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard it before. She took the document with trembling fingers and unfolded it, her eyes scanning words that made no sense. Medical authorization. Hospital admissions. St. Mary's Pediatric Cardiology Center. And then, in bold print at the bottom, paid in full. The document slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. Her knees went soft. She reached out to catch herself on the doorframe. "What is this?" she whispered. "Mr. Caruso's gift," Marco said. He placed a smaller envelope on top of the fallen document. "He also wished for you to have this. And he wanted you to know that when your son is well, there will be work. If you wish it. But there is no obligation. The debt between Mr. Caruso and you is already settled." Debt. The word hung in the air like smoke. Vivien wanted to speak. She wanted to ask questions, to demand explanations, to scream that she did not know anyone named Caruso and did not want anything from strangers. But her voice had abandoned her. Instead, she simply stared at Marco, and then at the 50 men in black filling her hallway and her street and her life like a tide she could not stop. Marco bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed utterly wrong in her doorway, in her poverty, in her small and unremarkable life. Then he turned and walked away. The other men followed, moving with synchronized precision, filing back down the stairs and into the street. Within 2 minutes, they were gone. The black SUVs pulled away one by one, disappearing into traffic, leaving behind only the faint smell of expensive cologne and the rumbling echo of expensive engines. Noah tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, are we in trouble?" She could not answer him. She simply bent down and held him, her fingers pressing into the fabric of his pajamas, her lips against the top of his warm head, her body shaking with something she could not name. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back 7 nights, to the frozen winter evening that changed everything. To the moment when a dying man was pulled from an alley by a woman who had nothing left to lose. To the moment when Lucian Caruso's world collided with Vivien Vasquez's invisible life, and neither of them would ever be the same. Because what she did not know was that the man whose life she saved that night was no ordinary person. What she did not know was that in Los Angeles, there were forces moving in the darkness, forces with power so vast and so absolute that they could appear in your hallway with 50 men and change your destiny before breakfast. What she did not know was that her one act of courage, pulling a stranger from the snow, refusing to look away from his suffering, would set in motion a chain of events that would crush her enemies, transform her pain, and bring her face to face with a man who had learned to rule empires through violence and fear but who would learn, through her, what it meant to love without condition. The rain began to fall as night descended on the city, cold and merciless, and somewhere in those dark streets, a story was about to unfold that would answer every prayer she had ever whispered in the dark. The clock on the diner wall showed 3 in the morning when Vivien Vasquez stepped into the alley behind the kitchen. Her breath came out in visible clouds, white against the November darkness, and she could feel the cold seeping through her coat, a thin polyester thing she'd bought 3 years ago at a discount outlet, now threadbare at the elbows. 28 degrees outside. Her fingers were numb even inside her work gloves, her nails bitten down from stress, her knuckles raw from washing dishes for 7 hours straight. The neon sign above the diner's back door cast everything in sickly pink, and behind her, she could still smell the grease and stale coffee that clung to her uniform like a second skin. She'd collected $34 in tips across her shift. $34. That was all the money between her and absolute nothing. Noah's cardiology bills were climbing toward $47,000 now, and her next shift wasn't until tomorrow night, which meant she had $34 to cover 3 days of groceries, gas for the ancient Honda that barely ran, and the phone bill that was due on the 15th. The garbage bag was heavy, splitting at the seams, and she half dragged it toward the dumpster when she heard the voices. Low. Vicious. Speaking Spanish so rapid she could only catch fragments. Deuda. Debt. Hermano. Brother. Pago. Vivien froze mid-step. The alley was dark except for a single flickering light above the kitchen door, and the shadows it cast made the brick walls look like a maze. The voices came from the far end, where the building made a sharp turn toward the street. She should have left the garbage and gone back inside. She should have locked the door and pretended she heard nothing. She stepped around the corner. 5 men stood against the far wall, their tailored wool coats the color of dried blood, their collars turned up against the cold. One had his arm raised, and against the brick wall, pinned like an insect, stood Miguel. The elderly busboy. 70 years old. Hands trembling. Your brother, the lead man was saying, his voice like gravel, owes $5,000. The Morales family does not forget debts. So you will go back to your family, you will tell them, and you will bring us payment, or your family will learn what happens when people steal from us. Miguel's lips were moving but no sound came out. His eyes were wide with terror. Vivien's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She thought of Noah sleeping in his hospital gown at St. Mary's, his small chest rising and falling, his valve replacement surgery scheduled for 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks to find $47,000 she did not have. 3 weeks for her life to change or for everything to fall apart. She had nothing left to lose. Leave him alone, she said. The words came out of her mouth before her brain could stop them. All 5 men turned. The lead enforcer was tall, with a scar running from his right eye to his jawline, and when he looked at Vivien, his face arranged itself into something that might have been amusement. The waitress, he said. How brave. How stupid. He's 70 years old, Vivien said. Her hands were shaking. She could feel her legs trembling beneath her uniform. He didn't do anything. Leave him alone. The man took a step toward her. His shoes clicked against the frozen pavement. He was wearing a gold ring on every finger, and the metal glinted in the weak light. You should go back inside, he said, before I decide you are part of this problem too. But Vivien didn't move. She stood there, her thin coat no protection against the December wind, her $34 in tips still in her apron pocket, her son sleeping in a hospital bed, her entire life balanced on the edge of a knife. She looked at Miguel's terrified face and thought about how many times in the past 6 months someone had told her to accept things she could not change. Accept that Noah was sick. Accept that she would never earn enough money. Accept that some people were born into suffering and that was simply the shape of their lives. I said, Vivien's voice came out barely a whisper but steady as steel, leave him alone. The enforcer took another step. His hand moved toward his coat. The other men shifted, anticipating violence the way dogs anticipate thunder. Miguel whimpered something in Spanish. The smell of fear was thick in the air now, mixing with the garbage smell and the winter smell of frozen concrete. Then the men parted. They simply moved to the side, revealing a figure leaning against the brick wall in the deeper shadows where the alley turned. A man in an expensive black cashmere coat worth more than 6 months of Vivien's rent. His face was angular and sharp, his eyes so dark they looked like pieces of night sky. He was holding his side, and when he shifted his weight, she saw the blood on his hand. Fresh blood. Wet blood. He was dying. Vivien knew what death looked like. She'd seen it on her mother's face 3 years ago, seen it in the hospital, seen it in the way a body goes still when the heart stops beating. This man had the same look, pale, distant, fading, but his eyes were alive in a way that terrified her more than the enforcer's gun ever could. Signore, the lead man said immediately, and his entire posture changed. Where moments before he had been violence itself, he was now something smaller, subordinate, apologetic. We didn't see you. We were just collecting a debt, the man said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, and it cut through the cold air like a blade. Yes. I can see that. He straightened slightly, though the movement cost him something. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. But you should know that this woman just saved your lives. The enforcer's face went pale. The other men exchanged looks of confused terror. Leave, the man in the black coat said simply. And do not come back to this alley. Do not come back to this diner. Do not come back to this part of the city. If I see any of you again, I will assume you are no longer interested in living. They ran. Actually ran, their expensive shoes pounding against the frozen ground, the sound of their retreating footsteps echoing off the brick. Within seconds, they were gone, melted back into the darkness from which they'd emerged. Vivien stood alone in the alley with a dying man and Miguel. The old busboy was crying, his shoulders shaking, his hands pressed against the brick wall behind him as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Gracias," he whispered. "Gracias, gracias, gracias." But Vivien's attention was fixed on the man in the black coat. He was bleeding more heavily now, his hand pressed against his side, blood seeping between his fingers. His breathing had changed, shallow, rapid, the sound of someone whose body was shutting down. "You need a hospital," Vivien said. She was already moving toward him, her mind overriding her fear. She'd worked in restaurants long enough to recognize a medical emergency. "How long have you been bleeding?" 20 minutes, he said. His eyes, impossibly, were still fixed on her face. Maybe longer. There was an ambush. Rivals. They didn't expect me to survive this long. "Then we need to move," Vivien said, but then she heard it, the sound of tires, multiple engines, the characteristic purr of expensive vehicles moving in perfect synchronization. Black Mercedes SUVs pulled around the corner, their headlights sharp as knives. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened before the car had fully stopped, and two men emerged. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second was smaller, more compact, with a scar on his neck and eyes that missed nothing. "Signore," the first man said, rushing toward them, "we need to move. Now." "Marco," the man in the black coat said, and Vivien heard a note of something almost like affection in his voice. This woman just faced down the entire Morales collection team to protect an old man. I want to remember her face. Marco, because that's who this man clearly was. Marco, a lieutenant or bodyguard or something else entirely, looked at Vivien with an expression that combined shock and something deeper. Respect, maybe. Recognition of something he didn't quite understand. "We need to get you to the safe house," Marco said quietly. "The wound is." "I know," the man interrupted. He pushed himself off the wall, and for a moment Vivien thought he would fall, but he didn't. He straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "What's your name?" "Vivien," she said. The name sounded strange in her own mouth, like she was introducing someone else entirely. He nodded once, slowly, as if committing the shape of it to memory. As if storing her face, her voice, the image of her standing in a frozen alley in a threadbare coat, beside a dying stranger. "Thank you," he said. "For what you did. For not looking away." Then Marco was guiding him toward the Mercedes, the other man, Gino, though she didn't know his name yet, supporting his other side. The man in the black coat turned back once, his dark eyes finding hers across the distance, and then he was inside the vehicle and the door was closing and the Mercedes was pulling away, tires gripping the icy asphalt, disappearing into the darkness like something from a dream. Miguel was still crying against the brick wall. Vivien helped him up with shaking hands, led him back through the kitchen door, got him a glass of water. He kept saying gracias, Vivien, gracias, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the moment when that man had looked at her like she was something remarkable instead of a waitress in a cheap coat with $34 to her name. She returned to the front of the diner. Anthony Marchetti, her manager, was behind the counter, his face twisted with rage. He was a thin man with slick back hair and the kind of smile that made you feel dirty. 15-minute break, he said flatly, means 15 minutes. You're late by 2 minutes. That's $2 out of your paycheck. So it was $32 now. $32 to last 3 days. Vivien didn't argue. She simply clocked back in and began wiping down the counter, her mind still in the alley, still seeing the blood on that man's hand, still hearing his voice like thunder in the frozen air. She had no idea who he was. She didn't know that the man she'd just saved was the second most powerful figure in organized crime in Los Angeles. She didn't know that she had just changed the trajectory of her entire life by refusing to look away. She only knew that she had done something tonight that mattered. And that knowledge, somehow, was more valuable than any amount of money. The morning sun filtered through the hospital's fluorescent panels like something broken and artificial. Vivien sat in the cardiology waiting room with Noah's small hand clutching hers, his 7-year-old fingers wrapped around her thumb with the grip of someone holding onto the only solid thing in a drowning world. The air smelled like antiseptic and fear, her fear, though she kept her face calm, kept her breathing steady, kept the trembling locked inside her chest where Noah couldn't see it. Dr. Patel entered carrying a tablet, her expression carefully neutral in the way doctors learn to wear masks. She was a woman in her 50s with silver streaking her black hair, kind eyes that somehow made terrible news sound worse because you knew she truly cared about delivering it. Noah's valve is deteriorating faster than we initially assessed, Dr. Patel said, pulling up an image. The replacement needs to happen within 7 days maximum. After that window, the risk of permanent cardiac damage becomes irreversible. 7 days. The words landed like a blade wrapped in ice. The surgery itself is straightforward for us, but the cost is significant. $47,000. Dr. Patel watched Vivien's face. Your insurance has denied coverage. They're calling it a pre-existing condition, even though this developed after your policy began. We're appealing, but the timeline is tight. $47,000. Vivien had $34 in her checking account. She had counted it that morning, 3 10s and 4 1s, folded inside her wallet like a prayer that couldn't possibly be answered. Mama. Noah's voice was small, frightened. Am I going to be okay? She looked down at her son's face, his brown eyes wide, his skin pale against the white hospital chair. He was asking the one question she couldn't answer truthfully without breaking something inside him. Always, baby, she whispered, and kissed his forehead. You're always going to be okay. It was a lie. It tasted like copper and ashes. That evening, Vivien clocked into the night shift at the diner. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song. The checkered floor was worn smooth by thousands of footsteps that had come before hers and would come after. She moved through the space like a ghost learning to be invisible again. Anthony Marchetti sat in the back office when she arrived, the small room thick with cheap cologne and cigarette smoke. He was a thin man in his late 40s with slicked back hair that looked wet even when it was dry, and eyes that never quite focused on your face, always sliding sideways, assessing, calculating. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a gold chain that caught the light like something caught in amber. He was counting bills from the register when she knocked. We need to talk about the missing money, he said without looking up. Neat stacks of cash lay arranged in front of him like pieces on a chessboard. I haven't taken anything, Vivien said quietly. Anthony's laugh was a sound like gravel in a blender. $300 short this month. $340 the month before. Funny how it's always when you're closing. He finally looked at her, his eyes cold. You know what I think? I think you're stealing from me. And when I call the police, it's going to be very hard for you to explain that away. Her throat tightened. I need this job. I haven't taken anything. I swear. What you need, he said, leaning back in his chair, is to understand that I own you. Your hours, your schedule, your future. So when I say you work the next 6 nights straight, you work them. When I say you take a pay cut because of inventory shortage, you take it. He paused. And when you mention taking medical leave next week for your sick kid, the answer is no. You take an authorized leave, you're done. No reference, no severance, nothing. You'll never work in this city again. The words landed one by one like small deaths. My son needs surgery, she heard herself say. In 7 days. I have to be there. I have to. Not my problem. Anthony turned back to his cash. You need medical leave? Get another job that provides it. This job? This job requires absolute availability, or it requires someone else sitting in your chair. Vivien left the office and returned to the counter, where 3 customers waited with empty cups. She poured coffee with shaking hands, the pot heavy as a weapon, as a threat, as a symbol of everything she couldn't change. The door chimed around 9 o'clock. A woman in a camel coat entered like she owned the building, and Vivien realized, with a sick lurch, that she probably did. Margaret Harrington moved to the counter with the easy grace of someone who had never once questioned her right to take up space. She was in her early 60s, sharp-featured, with blonde hair cut in a style that cost more than Vivien's monthly rent. Her eyes were pale grey and empty, like looking into a winter sky. She ordered a salad and sat at the corner booth, watching. Vivien delivered the food and tried to disappear back into the kitchen, but Margaret's voice cut across the diner, loud enough for every customer to hear. Anthony mentioned you work nights, Margaret said. Leaves your son home alone, doesn't it? A 7-year-old? How is that responsible parenting? Her smile was thin, surgical. I've been speaking with someone at Child Protective Services. They're very interested in cases where working mothers leave their children unsupervised. Especially children with serious health issues who aren't receiving proper care. The diner seemed to shrink around them. Vivien felt every eye in the room turning toward her, felt the weight of judgment like stones in her pockets. My son is with my neighbor, Vivien said quietly. He's safe. Is he? Margaret cut a piece of salad with precise movements. Because I have documentation showing you work 72 hours a week. That's a lot of nights away from home. A lot of opportunity for neglect. She met Vivien's eyes. Child Services will be visiting you soon. They'll want to assess your living situation. Your financial situation. Whether you're truly capable of being the parent your son needs. Vivien's hands went numb. Margaret returned to her salad, dismissing her entirely. Vivien retreated to the kitchen, where Anthony watched from the doorway with an expression that could have been triumph or hunger or something worse, pure satisfaction that someone else was suffering more than him. The next evening, Vivien walked into the pawn shop on 5th and Market. The windows were crammed with objects that represented other people's desperation, guitars with broken necks, televisions with cracked screens, jewelry that had belonged to people who no longer existed. The shop owner was a man in his 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. He barely glanced up when she entered. She opened her wallet and removed her mother's gold locket, the one piece of the before times, the only thing that proved her mother had existed, that they had once been a family where everyone was alive and together and safe. The locket was small, intricately carved, with a tiny hinge and a mechanism that still worked perfectly after 30 years. Inside was a photograph so faded you could barely see it anymore, her mother's face at 20, radiant, before the cancer, before the hospitals, before the debts that never stopped multiplying. How much? Vivien's voice broke on the word. The pawnbroker examined it under a magnifying light, his expression unchanged. Gold platings worn through in places. The mechanism's antique but not particularly valuable. He set it down. $340. She took it. She had to. 7 days remained before the surgery, and she now had $374 total. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Vivien drove to the hospital parking lot that night and sat in her car, a 2003 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and a check engine light that had been burning since the Obama administration. She gripped the steering wheel and thought about which organ she could sell, which part of herself could be harvested and converted into her son's survival. A kidney. Bone marrow. Half a liver, didn't they grow back? She was still thinking about it when the black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot. The car moved between the spaces like something predatory and deliberate. It parked 3 spots away, and the driver's door opened. Lucian Caruso stepped out into the November darkness. He moved toward her car with the same purposeful gait she remembered from the alley, each step controlled, deliberate, the walk of someone for whom violence was a language spoken fluently. In the harsh parking lot lights, she could see the details she'd missed in the darkness, the scar that ran from his left eye to his cheekbone like a blade had once tried to cut his face in half, the expensive suit that fit him like it had been painted on, the way his men, Marco and Gino, flanked him at a respectful distance, always ready, always watching. He tapped on her window. Vivien's heart hammered against her ribs as she lowered the glass. "Get out," Lucian said. Not a command, exactly. More like an invitation phrased as an inevitability. She got out. The November wind cut through the parking lot, carrying the smell of rain and asphalt. Lucian studied her face in the light spilling from the hospital's main entrance. "You didn't cash the check," he said finally. "I can't accept money from you." Her voice was steady, though everything inside her was fracturing. "I don't know you. I don't understand what you want from me. And I'm not going to owe anyone anything." "The money wasn't a transaction," Lucian said. "It was gratitude. You stood between armed men and a stranger. That's not something you see very often." I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting anyway. He paused. "Tell me about your son." She stiffened. "How do you?" "My people asked questions. That's what my people do." He waited, his dark eyes unreadable. "Noah. 7 years old. Congenital heart condition. Surgery scheduled for 7 days from now. Cost $47,000. Insurance denied. You currently have $374. The math doesn't work." Each fact landed like a punch. He knew everything. All of it. Every detail of her impossible situation. "I'll figure it out," Vivien said, though the words felt like lies. "Let me help." "Why?" Her voice rose, desperation cutting through politeness. "Why would someone like you help someone like me? I'm nobody. I work nights at a diner. I can't pay anyone back. What could you possibly want from me?" Lucian went very still. Behind him, Marco and Gino exchanged a glance, the kind of look that passed between men who had known each other for decades, a silent communication that said, "This has never happened before." When he spoke, his voice had changed. The controlled power was still there, but underneath it was something raw and terrible and real. 15 years ago, I lost someone," Lucian said quietly. "A child. Someone I should have been brave enough to save, but I wasn't. I've spent every day since wondering what it would have felt like to be someone like you, someone who sees suffering and acts anyway, without calculating the cost." He breathed in slowly. "I can't save the person I failed. But I can save your son. And maybe that will be enough to let me sleep without dreaming about the one I couldn't." Vivien heard the grief beneath every word. She saw the wound that had never closed, that probably never would. She recognized in him the same broken thing she carried inside herself. "Help me understand," she said. "What happens if I say yes? What happens to my life?" "Your life changes," Lucian said simply. "The surgery happens. Your son survives. You keep your job, or you find a better one. You rebuild." He paused. "And I stop carrying the weight of another person I couldn't save." Vivien felt something shift inside her chest, not hope exactly, but the ghost of hope, the memory of what hope felt like. Before she could answer, the hospital's back door opened and a figure emerged in the shadows. Margaret Harrington stood at the edge of the parking lot, her phone raised, photographing everything. The flash went off once, twice, 3 times, capturing Vivien with Lucian, with his men, with her face tilted up toward his in the darkness. Margaret lowered her phone and smiled. The hospital room was silent except for the beeping of machines that marked Noah's heartbeat like a metronome counting down the days Vivien had left. $47,000. That number sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and impossible and real. The surgeon had been kind when he delivered it, his voice gentle as he explained the valve replacement, the risk window, the fact that every day they waited made the surgery more dangerous. 7 days. That was the window. 7 days to find money that might as well have been 7 million. She sat in the vinyl chair beside Noah's hospital bed, watching her 5-year-old son sleep, his small chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital gown. His fingers were curled around the stuffed bear she had bought him last birthday, brown felt worn soft from constant holding, one plastic eye hanging by a thread. That bear had cost her $12. $12 she did not have. She had stolen it from a department store display while the security guard looked away, and she had never regretted that theft for a single moment. Noah clutched it now like it was made of gold. Her phone buzzed. A text from Anthony Marchetti, the diner manager. One message, no punctuation, all threat, you're late for your shift. She was always late for her shift. Late meant she was spending time with her son. Late meant she was not at the diner scrubbing grease from the counters and collecting dollar bills that strangers dropped like charity. She did not answer. She stayed in the chair and watched Noah sleep for another 7 minutes, until the guilt became unbearable, and then she kissed his forehead and left. The November night air hit her like a blade wrapped in ice when she stepped outside the hospital. The parking lot stretched dark and empty, sodium lights casting everything in sickly orange. Her old Honda Civic sat alone in the employees section, parked as far from the expensive cars as possible, as if poverty was contagious and might spread. She drove toward the diner with the radio off, just the sound of her own breathing and the engine's tired grinding. Anthony Marchetti was waiting for her when she arrived. He stood in the back office, a small room with filing cabinets and a desk and the smell of old grease embedded into the walls. He was 53 years old but carried himself like he owned the entire building, which he did, along with his sister Margaret, though Margaret stayed invisible and worked the theft from behind the scenes. Anthony had thinning hair combed over a spotted scalp, and he wore a gold chain around his neck that caught the fluorescent light. His face had gone red, the color he turned when he was about to fire someone, or threaten them, or both. "You're late," he said. "Not a question. I was with my son. He's in the hospital. I told you about the surgery. You told me a lot of things, Vivien. You told me you'd work double shifts. You told me you'd be reliable. You told me you'd stop asking for medical leave." He stepped closer. His breath smelled like coffee and something rotten underneath. "You're unreliable. You're a liability. And frankly, you bring down the whole establishment." She felt something crack open inside her chest. "Please. I need this job. The surgery is in 7 days. I need every paycheck. Should have thought of that before you started making friends with the wrong people." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Before you brought criminals into my diner. Before you decided my place was a good location to conduct your business." She had not brought Lucian into the diner. The diner had been where she worked, and Lucian had found her there because that was where she was every day and every night. But Anthony did not care about truth. Anthony cared about power and the feeling of having it over someone else. "You're fired," he said. "Effective immediately. You can pick up your final paycheck next Friday. It'll be for this week minus the wage theft we've been documenting. You've been taking extra breaks, eating food without paying for it. That comes out to about $300 we're owed." She made $650 a week, before taxes, before everything. $300 gone meant Noah's medication would not be filled. It meant she would have to choose between gas and groceries. It meant the surgery moved further away instead of closer. "You can't do that," she whispered. "I can do whatever I want. You see that door?" He gestured to the back exit, the one that led to the alley. "You're walking through it right now. Don't come back. If you come back, I'll call the police and tell them you stole from the register. Who do you think they'll believe, a diner owner or a homeless woman who sleeps in her car?" She did not sleep in her car. She had a studio apartment, 2 rooms, and a bathroom the size of a closet, rent paid 2 weeks late because she had chosen Noah's medication over the landlord. But to Anthony, anyone poor enough to struggle was basically homeless. The distinction did not matter to him. "Please," she said again, though she knew it was useless. "I'm begging you." "Begging is pathetic," he said. "And pathetic is what you are." He walked toward her, and she moved toward the door because there was nowhere else to go. He stood close enough that she could feel his breath, close enough that his body blocked the exit completely. His hand came up and rested on the frame, trapping her. She could see the wedding ring on his finger, could see the small white scar on his knuckle where he had once punched a wall. "Maybe you should find another way to make money," he said quietly. "I hear there are girls who make real cash. Girls like you, desperate, nothing to lose. You'd be good at that, I think." She felt her stomach turn. She moved sideways, squeezed past him through the gap between his body and the door frame. He did not try to stop her. He just smiled, and that smile was worse than any violence could have been. The alley behind the diner was exactly as dark as it had been the night she met Lucian. The dumpsters smelled like rotting meat and old vegetables. Her footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. November rain had fallen earlier, and now everything was slick and gleaming under the pale moon. She walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat and did not cry because crying would waste the energy she needed to figure out how to survive the next 7 days. Her pocket held $34. $34 was all that stood between her and complete catastrophe. She needed $7,000 per day for the next 7 days to reach the surgery cost. $7,000 per day. She had $34. She drove to her apartment, a building that smelled like mildew and other people's desperation. The walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors' arguments through them, could hear the sound of someone weeping 2 doors down, could hear the television blaring in Spanish from the unit above. She climbed the stairs. The elevator had been broken for 3 months, and unlocked her door. The apartment was cold. She had not run the heat because heat cost money. Instead, she wore 3 sweaters and kept blankets piled on the bed where she and Noah slept together, his small body curled against hers like he was trying to climb back inside. Tonight he was still at the hospital, scheduled for observation until morning. Tomorrow the social worker would come. She knew this because the hospital had called her that afternoon after she had left Noah's room. The social worker's name was Dr. Patricia Chen, and her tone had been professionally sympathetic. "We need to assess your home situation," Dr. Chen had said, "to make sure Noah will have adequate care during his recovery. This is just a standard evaluation." Standard. Everything was standard. The way drowning was standard for people who could not swim. Vivien sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness and pulled out her mother's gold locket from under her pillow. The chain was thin, delicate, and inside was a photograph so old it had faded to almost nothing, her mother at 25, smiling before life had broken her. Vivien had worn this locket for 29 years. She had pawned it once, 2 years ago, when Noah was sick with pneumonia and the antibiotics cost $300. She had retrieved it with her tax refund, had sworn she would never pawn it again. But $47,000 was impossible. And if she lost Noah to the state because her apartment was not clean enough or warm enough or full enough, then her mother's locket would not matter anyway. She packed it carefully in a small velvet bag and set it on the nightstand. She would go to the pawn shop tomorrow. She would get maybe $800. It was not $7,000, but it was $800 more than she had today. At 2 in the morning, across the city in the Brentwood Hills, Lucian Caruso made a phone call. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Find everything on Anthony Marchetti and his sister Margaret," he said. "I want documentation of every dollar they have stolen, every law they have broken, every life they have ruined. And I want it within 6 hours." By dawn, he knew everything. 15 years of embezzlement. $2 million stolen from employees. Dozens of complaints filed and ignored. Tax fraud across 7 different businesses. Margaret Harrington's connection to a federal crime ring. Anthony's connection to loan sharks. Insurance fraud. Wage theft from 37 workers. Lucian stood on his penthouse balcony as the sun rose over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Below him, the city was waking up. Somewhere down there, Vivien Vasquez was preparing to pawn her mother's locket. Somewhere down there, a 5-year-old boy was sleeping in a hospital bed, waiting for his mother to save him. Lucian had said he could not save the person he had failed. But perhaps he had been wrong. He turned from the window and spoke into his phone. Send Marco and Gino. Full tactical operation. 2 targets, simultaneous raids, 2 a.m. I want them destroyed completely. Not dead. Destroyed. At that same hour, Vivien sat in the waiting room of the County Social Services office, her hands shaking. Dr. Patricia Chen was with Noah in a separate room, conducting what they called a safety evaluation. Vivien could not be present. She sat in a plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights and tried not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. When Dr. Chen emerged, she looked tired. She sat down beside Vivien and pulled out a tablet. I've reviewed Noah's medical file, she said. The surgery is needed. I've also reviewed your apartment. The condition is poor, but that's not the primary concern. The primary concern is resources. Can you provide for his medical needs? Can you afford the surgery? Vivien's voice came out small. I'm trying. I'm trying so hard. I know you are. Dr. Chen's eyes were kind, which somehow made it worse. But we have an obligation to the child. We have a program that can fund his surgery through the state. But it requires temporary placement in a licensed foster home during his recovery. 6 weeks, minimum. That way he gets 24-hour medical supervision, and the surgery is fully covered. The words landed like stones dropping into dark water. Temporary placement. 6 weeks. She would lose him. Even if it was temporary, even if he came back, she would lose him. No, Vivien said. Please. I can find the money. I will find the money. How? Dr. Chen asked gently. Be honest with me. How will you find $47,000 in the next 6 days? Vivien had no answer. There was no answer. There was only the void that opened up beneath her, the infinite dark of failure and loss. She left the office in a daze. The November sun was sharp and cold against her skin. She walked for no reason, just moving, putting one foot in front of the other, until she found herself on a fire escape on the edge of the city. She looked down 7 stories to the street below. People moved like insects from this height. Cars like toys. Her problems from this height would be invisible. It would be so easy. She thought about her mother, who had tried this same calculation and arrived at a different answer. She thought about Noah, alone in a foster home, waiting for his mother. She thought about the stuffed bear with the plastic eye hanging by a thread. She pulled out her phone and dialed the only number she had memorized besides Noah's hospital extension. Lucian answered before the second ring. Help me, she whispered. Please. I'm going to lose him. You're not going to lose him, Lucian said. His voice was steady, certain. Listen to me. You're going to go to the hospital. You're going to stay with Noah tonight. And you're going to let me handle the rest. Why would you do that? She asked. Because I know what it is to stand at the edge and choose survival, he said. Now choose survival. Go to your son. She climbed back through the window. Inside the apartment, Noah slept in the darkness, and his chest rose and fell, and she breathed with him, and she did not jump. At 2 a.m. precisely, 12 men in black moved through Los Angeles like ghosts through a world that had forgotten them. They were dressed in tactical gear, professional, silent. They moved with the precision of men who had done this before, men who understood that violence was a last resort and efficiency was the first. Marco led the first team to Margaret Harrington's Brentwood mansion. The house sat behind electric gates, surrounded by landscaping that cost more than Vivien made in a year. The gates opened at Marco's approach. He had a code, had prepared everything. They moved through the darkness like water finding its path. Margaret woke to 6 men surrounding her bed. She screamed, and one of them placed a hand over her mouth, not violently, just a reminder of how powerless she was. Marco stood at the foot of the bed, and he opened a laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen were 15 years of financial records. Embezzlement. Tax fraud. Forged documents. Payoffs. Everything. The FBI will receive this at dawn, Marco said, and his voice was cold like a knife. Federal marshals will arrest you publicly. 40 years minimum. You don't understand, Margaret gasped. My family, my connections. Your brother already talked, Marco said. He'll testify against you for reduced sentence. You're alone now. They left her there, sobbing, her world collapsing in real time. At the same moment, 3 blocks away, Gino's team entered Anthony Marchetti's apartment. They found him trying to burn financial records in the kitchen sink, smoke rising in the darkness. Gino stopped him with a gesture, effortless, and showed him the federal indictment. Racketeering. Wage theft. Witness intimidation. 20 years, Gino said. Federal prison. Anthony collapsed, trembling like a cornered animal, his voice breaking into sobs. He tried to negotiate, to bargain, to save himself by sacrificing Margaret. It was too late. By 4 a.m., both villains had been systematically dismantled. Not through death, which would have been too quick, too easy, too merciful, but through the destruction of everything they had built. Their money frozen. Their reputations obliterated. Their freedom approaching its expiration date. The news broke at dawn. By noon, every station was running the story. By evening, 2 million people had viewed the footage of Margaret Harrington being led away by federal agents in her own driveway, her face streaked with tears, her expensive clothes disheveled. By the next morning, Anthony Marchetti's mugshot was everywhere, his expression destroyed, his future erased. Vivien did not know any of this yet. She sat in Noah's hospital room, holding his small hand, when the pounding started on her apartment door. 50 men in black had arrived. Not to arrest her. To serve her. Vivien did not know any of this yet. She sat in Noah's hospital room, holding his small hand as he slept, when the pounding started on her apartment door at 5 in the morning. Heavy. Deliberate. The sound of something that would not be ignored. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had called her an hour earlier. 50 men in black suits filled the hallway outside her apartment. They lined the stairs. They stood in formation in the lobby. The entire building had woken to watch them arrive like a military operation. Vivien's heart had stopped. She had grabbed Noah from his bed, bundled him into her car, and driven to the hospital. Surely nowhere safer existed than a pediatric floor with security and witnesses and people in white coats. But they found her anyway. A knock on the hospital room door. Soft. Respectful. A man she recognized immediately, Marco, his silver-streaked hair and sharp dark eyes, wearing a suit that cost more than 4 months of her old rent. Behind him, through the open doorway, she could see 2 more men in identical black suits, their hands folded respectfully in front of them. Noah woke and pressed against her. Miss Vasquez, Marco said, and his voice was nothing like she expected. Not threatening. Not cold. Something closer to reverence. May we speak privately? She moved Noah into the small bathroom attached to the hospital room, told him to stay there, to keep the door locked, to not come out no matter what he heard. He nodded, frightened and obedient in the way children become when their world has already shifted beneath their feet too many times. She turned back to Marco. He held a briefcase. Black leather, expensive, the kind of object that contained either futures or devastations. He opened it without speaking. $50,000 in stacked bills. Vivien's knees went weak. She sat down on the edge of the hospital bed because standing became impossible. $47,000, exactly, Marco said, his voice soft and steady like someone speaking to an injured animal. The cost of Noah's surgery. The remainder covers your other debts. Medical, rent, utilities, everything that creditors have been pursuing you for. All of it resolved as of this morning. She could not speak. The amount of money was too large. It did not exist in her universe. It was theoretical, abstract, impossible. Marco continued. He did not rush. Anthony Marchetti and Margaret Harrington have been arrested on federal charges. Embezzlement. Tax fraud. Racketeering. Witness intimidation. They will spend the remainder of their lives in prison. They will not trouble you again. Ever. He placed a folder on the bed beside the money. Inside were documents, charges, evidence, their confessions. Margaret Harrington's teary mugshot stared up from the page, her expensive blonde hair disheveled, her face streaked with destruction. Mr. Caruso also asked me to return something, Marco said. He opened a velvet box. Inside, nestled in cream-colored silk, was her mother's gold locket. The one she had pawned 4 days ago at the pawn shop on Figueroa Street for $40. The locket that contained a single photograph of her mother's face, taken in 1987, before the illness, when her mother was still whole. Vivien's tears came finally. Not delicate. Not quiet. They poured down her face like floodwater, and she could not stop them because her body understood what her mind could not yet process. Everything had changed. Everything. He asked me to tell you something, Marco said, and something shifted in his expression, a softness that seemed impossible on a man who carried violence inside him like other men carried keys. He said that debts of honor are paid in full. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow at Cedars-Sinai. Dr. Chen, the best pediatric cardiologist on the West Coast. All arrangements made. Noah will have the best care available in this city. Why? Vivien whispered. Why would he do this? Marco's gaze held hers. Because you gave him something he thought was gone forever. Hope. He set a business card on the bed. A phone number. An address. Then he and the other men withdrew as silently as they had arrived, their footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor. Vivien sat alone with $50,000 and her mother's locket and the knowledge that the universe had tilted. She called Noah out from the bathroom. She showed him the money without explaining where it came from, only that his surgery would happen tomorrow, that he would be okay, that they would be okay. He did not fully understand, but he understood the relief in her voice, and that was enough. The surgery happened at dawn. 8 hours and 15 minutes. Dr. Chen emerged with a smile, saying the valve replacement was successful, that Noah would recover beautifully, that he would have a normal childhood now. A normal childhood. Vivien sat beside her son's recovery bed and wept again, the locket pressed against her chest. Weeks passed. She took medical leave from the diner. She sat with Noah through his recovery, reading him stories, watching him heal, watching color return to his small face. The medical bills never arrived. They were simply gone, erased from existence. An upscale restaurant called her 3 weeks later with a job offer. Head server position. Legitimate. Well paid. Benefits. Her apartment rent was mysteriously paid 6 months in advance. Small protection she noticed but did not fully understand. Money appearing to cover her phone bill, her groceries, the new coat Noah needed for winter. She asked no questions. She had learned not to interrogate miracles. Months passed. The seasons changed. She saved money steadily for the first time in her life. She reclaimed her locket from the hospital gift box and wore it every day, the cool metal against her skin a reminder that salvation existed somewhere outside the architecture of her suffering. 6 months after the surgery, Lucian Caruso walked into her restaurant. He was alone. No Marco. No armed men. Just him, tall and severe in a charcoal suit, requesting her section. When her shift ended, he asked if she had a moment. They walked to Griffith Park, where the city sprawled below them and the night air carried the smell of sage and distant rain. "Thank you," Vivien said, and her voice was steady now, no longer the trembling thing it had been. "For everything you've done. For Noah. For saving us." "You would have done it anyway," Lucian replied. "You always find a way." She studied him. Even in moonlight, his eyes held depths she could not measure. "You've been watching over us?" "From distance," he said. "I didn't want to intrude." A long silence. "Then, you mentioned a child once. Your son?" Lucian's jaw tightened. "He died before he ever lived. Stillborn. 15 years ago. His room is still perfect in my home. I couldn't bear to change it." Vivien reached over and took his hand. "I'm sorry." They stood together in that communion of grief, two broken people recognizing the cracks in each other's foundations. "When I saw you step between those men in the alley," Lucian said slowly, "I saw courage I'd forgotten existed. You reminded me that some people still fight for others even when they're drowning themselves. You saved me. Not from death. From becoming someone I could no longer recognize." This was where love began. Not in rescue, but in recognition. Two people seeing each other whole. Time moved forward. Seasons changed again. Noah grew stronger. His scar healed. He ran in parks without stopping to rest. Vivien and Lucian saw each other regularly, slow conversations over coffee, dinners at quiet restaurants, him teaching her about art and history, her teaching him about hope and the possibility of beginning again. One evening in his penthouse, he finally showed her the nursery. They stood in the doorway together, looking at the untouched room, the perfect crib, the toys still in their boxes. "He was real," Vivien said softly. "He mattered. And you can honor him while still living." Lucian squeezed her hand. "You've already helped me do that." The final image is simple, the three of them in a diner booth, the same diner where Vivien had once collected $34 in tips. Noah healthy and laughing, eating pancakes with chocolate syrup. Lucian beside them, this dangerous man made gentle by the presence of love. Marco and Gino at a nearby table, watching their boss transformed, barely recognizing the man he had become. Vivien looked across at Lucian. "Thank you. For everything." "Thank you," he replied. "For reminding me who I wanted to be." In the sprawling city of Los Angeles, Vivien Vasquez was no longer invisible. She had been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood that real strength is not about power. It is about choosing courage even when you have nothing left to lose. And sometimes, when you save someone else, you save yourself too. After the rain, the sky clears. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. If this story moved your heart, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story of unexpected grace waiting for you. And remember, your kindness might be someone else's miracle. You never know who's watching. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.